Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today, we'll be exploring the need for novel folklore in an Iranian Renaissance. My guest is my good friend, Reza Jorjani, a philosopher and the author of many books, including Prometheus and Atlas, World State of Emergency, Lovers of Sophia, novel folklore, of course, which will be the subject of today's interview, and Iranian Leviathan, which undoubtedly we'll also be touching upon. Welcome, Jason.
Thank you, Jeffrey. It's a pleasure, as always.
It's my pleasure as well. To begin with, if we're talking about novel folklore and your very unique approach to it, obviously we'll be talking about Sadegh Hedayat's great novel, The Blind Owl.
We will be, but one thing I hope to make clear in the course of this discussion is that the title novel folklore doesn't simply refer to Hedayat's book. It is a concept that I'm trying to develop from out of Nietzsche and Heidegger in the course of my exegesis of Hedayat's Blind Owl. So, Hedayat's Blind Owl is folklore in the form of a novel, which is somewhat paradoxical because folklore is the oldest narrative structure that we have in human history, usually dominant in oral cultures, although it survives, past the advent of literature. And I would agree with Heidegger that it still forms the substrate of every society today. But folklore is associated with oral cultures and is the oldest form of narrativity. And Hedayat was a folklorist. But then the novel is the most modern form of literary expression. We had people like Petronius writing Satyricon in the Roman period, and other things that in some ways were similar to novels, prose narratives that were similar to novels, but they weren't quite the same because this revolution of subjectivity that occurred around the time of Descartes, where you get first-person narratives, really hadn't taken place yet in the Roman epoch. So I would say the novel is a quintessentially modern form of literary expression. So the phrase novel folklore is somewhat ironic and paradoxical. And I would argue that the Blind Owl, Hedayat's Blind Owl, is an attempt at fusing the folkloric with the novel. But there's a deeper meaning also to novel folklore, and that has to do with the project of attempting to generate a new folklore as the basis for the evolution of a society.
Mm-hmm. Well, we've done a previous interview just on the Blind Owl, and I'm going to link to it right now for viewers who haven't seen it. It's really worth going into because in that context, we talked about the Blind Owl as a very important novel or book in and of itself. Today, we're looking at it in relationship to the idea of an Iranian Renaissance.
Right. And so I don't want to really focus too much on Sadegh Hedayat and his life, from a biographical perspective. If viewers are interested in that, they should watch our previous discussion on Hedayat and the Blind Owl. But as you said, I'd like to focus more on the concept of novel folklore and the way in which the Blind Owl is appropriating, but also dynamically adapting certain mythical ideas and symbols from out of the Iranian heritage.
It's worth mentioning that this book has a unique place in the history of Iranian literature.
It's probably considered widely as the most important work of modern Persian literature. And so, you find a number of symbols in this novel that come from Zoroastrianism. And, as we've discussed previously, Hedayat studied the Middle Persian language in Bombay and is considered somewhat of a scholar of ancient Iranian religion and mythology. But the ways in which he critically adapts some of these symbols in the Blind Owl is really revolutionary. And I think people who try to interpret Hedayat as an advocate for some kind of conservative or orthodox restoration of Zoroastrianism are doing the man a great disservice and underappreciating his genius.
Well, let's begin to get into why that would be the case.
So there's this idea of the Dana in Zoroastrianism, the inner conscience spectrally projected in the form of a female. After you die, you're supposed to encounter an exteriorization of your conscience in the form of a female, and depending on the state of your conscience, she's either, a youthful Valkyrie, immaculately pure youthful Valkyrie, or she's like an old hag, or anything in between, or a lascivious whore also are some of the descriptions of, how one's inner conscience can be reflected in one's Dana upon death. And you're supposed to meet this figure on the bridge of judgment on the way to, the final destiny of your soul. And we see Hedayat incorporate the Dana into the Blind Owl in the form of, this is a novel that takes place in at least two distinct time frames. Medieval Ray, the city of Ray, which later became Tehran, and then the modern Tehran of Hedayat's period, the Tehran contemporary to the early phase of Hedayat's life. And in the medieval time period, the Dana takes the form of the wife of the narrator. And then in the early modern Tehran time frame, she is this ethereal woman who shows up at the doorstep of the narrator's home and comes in and surrenders her body, lays down on his bed to die. She's a kind of fairy-like creature. And so this is the Dana figure, in both time frames of the Blind Owl. But if you pay close attention to how Hedayat deals with this figure, you'll see that, and with the emotions and attitudes of the protagonist toward this figure, you'll see that he's trying to develop a notion of the Dana that is not a moral conscience, but conscience in the sense of personal authenticity, an authenticity that lies beyond rigid judgments of good versus evil. And in that way, I think that his development of the Dana idea runs parallel to Friedrich Nietzsche's idea of seizing fortuna, of fortune as a woman, and of being conscientious in the sense of being faithful to one's own genius and aiming at personal authenticity, rather than living within the confines of any established moral system.
Well, it's interesting that you're invoking Nietzsche at this point, because Nietzsche also is famous for his work, also Sprach Zarathustra.
Indeed. And, there's a direct relationship between the Blind Owl and Thus Spoke Zarathustra. The idea of the Superman appears in the Blind Owl. It's quite clear that Hedayat is setting forth a certain vision of the Übermensch, where there are parts of the novel in which the protagonist expresses attaining a superhuman condition, achieving powers that are beyond the human. And these are, in fact, explicitly associated with the serpent venom poisoned wine that he drinks, and the serpent dancer, who is his mother. And so Hedayat's also connecting this notion of superhuman power to the Indian idea of Shakti, the tantric Indian idea of Shakti. And
the female goddess.
Yes, well, the goddess of power, and the goddess most closely associated with the siddhis, or the superpowers, which are pursued most daringly by adherents of the left-hand path outside of the confines of conventional Hindu morality. And this is something we discussed previously in relation to the blind owl. But so with reference to Nietzsche, and thus spoke Zarathustra, you have this image of the Übermensch, of the Superman in the blind owl. And you also have the protagonist railing against the rabble, expressing profound contempt for mass man. As a herd of cattle that are concerned only with eating and sex and are fundamentally asleep and lacking in any personal integrity. And so in that way as well, the blind owl parallels the Nietzschean distinction between the Übermensch and the Untermenschen, the subhumans, or, the rabble, as Nietzsche also, as Nietzsche's Zarathustra also sometimes calls them. But then what's fascinating about the blind owl is that Hedayat also deconstructs this dichotomy between the Superman and the last man or the mass men, by paralleling or mirroring certain descriptions of the narrator in certain characterizations of people who he lumps together with the mass men. I mean, there are a number of characters in The Blind Owl. The old odds and ends man, the narrator's uncle, people who are degenerate. They are somehow just very unsavory characters, and morally corrupt, at least highly morally questionable. And yet, at various turns in the novel, the descriptions of these characters are mirrored almost word for word by characterizations of the protagonist. And so there is, at the same time, an attempt to deconstruct such a radical dichotomy between the Superman and mass men.
So Hedayat is essentially saying that these unsavory characters are what you might call exteriorizations of his own inner world.
Yeah, and this relates to the idea of syzygies and other Persian Gnostic concepts that you find in Manichaeism. Because in Manichaeism, on the one hand, there is this distinction, as in many forms of Gnosticism, between an enlightened elite and the majority of society, who are basically unconscious playthings of the archons. And so the Gnostic is a radically alienated individual generally, and in Gnostic worldviews, and including in Manichaeism. But at the same time, in Manichaeism, you have the idea of a syzygy, or a single soul being incarnated in more than one body. And Hedayat plays with this idea in The Blind Owl, where we get the sense that all of these unsavory characters in the novel, both male and female, are projections from out of the narrator's psyche. They are exteriorized shadow sides of the narrator's own psyche. And so on the one hand, he's adopting the Manichaean syzygy idea, and on the other hand, he's deconstructing the Manichaean dualism of the enlightened Gnostic who's radically alienated versus the masses of unconscious people in society, the Hylic people, the materialistically inclined people. So he's adopting elements of Manichaeism and critiquing other elements of Manichaeism. And this is the kind of critical attitude that Hedayat has toward the Iranian tradition in general. While I'm on that subject, let me also mention that even Nietzsche's distinction between the Übermensch and the Untermenschen, and Nietzsche's emphasis on personal conscience and on the authenticity of the individual, themes that become and the alienation of the individual from society, themes that become central to existentialism in subsequent figures such as Heidegger and Sartre, have been traced back to ancient Iranian spirituality. In his book on the Gnostic religion, his classic study of the Gnostics, Hans Jonas argued that Heideggerian existentialism can be traced back to Iranian Gnosticism specifically.
So in the case of Nietzsche, is he also embracing this critique of the duality between the Übermensch and the Untermensch, or is he buying into it?
Well, I think he's buying into it more than he's critiquing it. Although there is this scene in Thus Spoke Zarathustra where Zarathustra is carrying the midget or the dwarf on his back all the way up the mountain, and at a certain point, Zarathustra falls ill from the recognition that he and the dwarf are one. And this is, a kind of way that Nietzsche is trying to suggest that it's impossible to wholly separate the Superman from the Untermenschen. But by and large, in Nietzsche's worldview, this dichotomy is retained. Whereas Hedayat presents that dichotomy in The Blind Owl, but then he also deconstructs it.
So with regard to the idea of an Iranian Renaissance, I gather that you're suggesting that those people who hold up Hedayat as an advocate for the restoration of Zoroastrian culture in Iran miss the fact that he's also critiquing.
Yeah, I think that Hedayat would have had an even more critical view of Zarathustra than perhaps Nietzsche did. In Ecce Homo, Nietzsche says, I've not been asked as I ought to have been why I chose Zarathustra as my mouthpiece. And he goes on to explain that Zarathustra is worthy of great reverence for having been the inventor of the moral worldview. Zarathustra is the first person to have elaborated a cosmology in terms of abstract principles and a morality that wasn't based on the conventional customs of a particular society, but on absolute good and absolute evil. He, as Nietzsche puts it, introduced morality into the wheelwork of history and a cosmic history. In fact, he came up with the idea of cosmic history, of, an evolving universe tending toward an apocalyptic end of history. And, but so Nietzsche says that, yes, we should recognize this genius of Zarathustra, but truth is also the highest virtue in Zoroastrianism. Nietzsche has a whole narrative about the transformations of the will to truth throughout the course of history, how it's ultimately recognized through the transformation that the will to truth undergoes in Christianity. It's ultimately recognized on the other side of nihilism that the will to truth is the will to power. So Zarathustra is the one that posited truth as the highest value. And in Nietzsche's eyes, he's the most honest thinker that there ever was. And so if Zarathustra himself were to return today, which is the narrative of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, it's a returned Zarathustra. And if Zarathustra were to return today, he would be the first person to invert his own teaching. The inventor of morality would recognize it as the greatest error himself and invert it. And I think that Hedayat would have taken very much the same view of Zarathustra. That, what that man with his creative genius would have advocated today would have been very different, if not diametrically opposite, to what he advocated, nearly 3,000 years ago.
Well, Nietzsche, of course, is well known for having authored Beyond Good and Evil, in which basically he is, as I read it, it's a critique of Christian morality. But in a previous interview, as a matter of fact, one of our recent interviews, you pointed out that one of the great Christian theologians, Teilhard de Chardin, with his notion of the cosmic Christ, the perfection of Christ at the end of time, actually, that idea was derived from Zoroastrian thinking, conveyed to Teilhard by way of Russian cosmists whom he associated with in Paris.
That's right. And you see this kind of utopianism critiqued in The Blind Owl as well. In particular, Hedayat takes aim at the medieval form of this Zoroastrian utopianism. In the medieval epoch, in Iran, there was a philosopher by the name of Shahab al-Din Sohrawardi, who was ultimately, in 1191, executed as a heretic by the Caliphate. And Shahab al-Din Sohrawardi elaborated a certain version of the Zoroastrian idea of a utopian realm of light taking shape at the apocalypse, at the end of history. And this was a realm, though, that you could access in any particular historical epoch, but it would become the dominant reality. It would sort of supplant the physical world at the end of time. And this is called Nakoja Abode, or Neverland, Nowhere Land, Neverland. Literally utopia. I mean, it translates, in an identical way as the classical Greek term utopia. But Henry Corbin, who was, a great Iranologist in the 20th century, mid-20th century, and also a prominent student of Heidegger.
And a close friend of Carl Jung. Yes.
Because of that, also adopted the archetypes as a very prominent idea in his thought. Corbin really focused on Sohrawardi out of all of his Iranian studies. And he insisted that Nakoja Abad is not utopia in the sense in which that idea was developed by science fiction authors. That, these science fictional worlds of tomorrow that we find from Francis Bacon's New Atlantis, onwards to H.G. Wells' The Shape of Things to Come. These visions of utopia shouldn't be conflated with Nakoja Abad, because, what one person considers a utopia, like the rulers of, the society in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, could legitimately, to someone else's eyes, be a horrific dystopia. Yeah. And Corbin wants to preserve the purity of Nakoja Abad as a sacred idea, as a realm of refuge from the sufferings and tragedies of this world. But Hedayat takes Nakoja Abad and puts it into The Blind Owl as this ethereal geometric city, this creepy city where all the buildings are in polygonal form, and there are these almond-shaped dark windows that look like eyes staring out at you, and the walls have a phosphorescent glow at night. He inserts this city into both the past lifetime frame of the Blind Owl and the contemporary time frame. It's both someplace that the narrator wanders into from medieval Ray and also from modern Tehran. And so it's this kind of trans-temporal imaginal realm. But Hedayat depicts it in such a macabre way, as a kind of Twilight Zone, that it winds up being a critique of the Nakoja Abad idea. In particular, he shows all of the people who he's associated with in his life, the odds and ends, the old odds and ends man, the hearse driver, and so on and so forth, the denizens of his society. He shows them all dead and mangled in that world to suggest that it's a world where humanity's gone extinct. It is a world beyond the end of humanity, and it is the abode of the fairies, the patties, like the patty, the fairy who comes and takes refuge with him, the one who walks up to his doorstep and comes into his home and surrenders her body to him, the fairy who was his wife in a past life. And so Hedayat is engaging in this critique of the Zoroastrian idea of a utopia, suggesting that there's never going to be a realm of light that's totally purified of all darkness, where all of the darkness has been distilled from out of it. And our attempt to seek such a utopia is a deflection away from facing the demons within ourselves.
Now, you use the term an imaginal realm. To my knowledge, that's a term that was coined by Henri Corbin.
It was coined by Frederick Myers. And I think Corbin is drawing on Myers' sense of the term of, the imaginal as the future evolutionary state, where an imago is a perfected form of an insect, like a butterfly, as compared to the caterpillar. And so the imaginal realm is the realm in which we will all have achieved our perfected forms, which is a Zoroastrian idea. There's the belief that we are all evolving toward our perfected form, and that after a freshgard, or alchemical transmutation of the world, our bodies are going to be perfect instantiations of our personal archetypes. Mm-hmm. But that these archetypes have a kind of trans-temporal existence before this apocalypse takes place. They already exist, except we're being drawn toward, through history, we're being drawn toward the eternity in which this is already the case.
A kind of perfection at the end of time.
Yeah, at the end of time, but that also has a trans-temporal power to it.
Mm-hmm. I mean, as I understand Corbin's work, which was discussed previously by me in some in-presence monologues I did riffing, so to speak, on Peter Kingsley's work of Carl Jung and the End of Humanity. Corbin seems to suggest that, to my way of thinking, that the imaginal realm exists, one could say, in the imagination, but it's not imaginary.
No, he although he's not very explicit about it, because I think he doesn't want to be derided, and he's sensitive about, having skeptics come down on him. He takes a very psychical view of the imaginal and believes that it has a reality. Yeah. And he attributes ESP and telekinesis and so forth to the realm of the imaginal.
And of course, you mentioned Frederick Myers, who was the great psychical researcher and author of the human personality and its survival of bodily death, which I think brings us to the whole question of the afterlife and its various manifestations as depicted in The Blind Owl.
Yeah, so reincarnation is a huge theme in The Blind Owl. And this is another way in which Hedayat defies definition as an advocate for restoration of Zoroastrianism in any orthodox form. Because reincarnation is not an idea that's part of orthodox Zoroastrianism. There's a belief in the afterlife, in a kind of heavenly or hellish afterlife after the judgment of the soul, which was the prototype for the Judeo-Christian and Muslim view of the afterlife. That's the conventional view in Orthodox Zoroastrianism.
As well as Orthodox Christianity.
Yeah, but it is false to argue that reincarnation is not an Iranian idea, and that this is evidence of Hedayat's eclecticism and of his being influenced by Indian culture, where he took up a residence for some years in Bombay. The idea of reincarnation is in the Iranian spiritual tradition from the beginning. We've done another program in which we discuss how Gautama Buddha may have been a Scythian sage, may have been an Iranian presenting a rival spiritual worldview to Zoroastrianism. And then when the prophet Mani in this early Sasanian period tries to synthesize Buddhism with Zoroastrianism, and he recognizes Zarathustra, Buddha, and Christ as the three great world teachers, one of the elements of Buddhism that he incorporates into Manichaeism is the belief in rebirth. Mm-hmm. Then the Mazdakite Gnostic movement of the later Sasanian period also included a belief in reincarnation. And even after the Islamic conquest of Iran, you can see, despite its heretical status with respect to Islamic orthodoxy, you can see the belief in reincarnation surviving in the Order of Assassins and other radical Shiite groups, particularly the Ismailis. So reincarnation has a long-standing history in the spiritual universe of Iran, and it's an idea that Hedayat incorporates fundamentally into The Blind Owl.
Yeah, because the Blind Owl shows basically two historical epochs that somehow are in relationship through reincarnation to each other.
Yeah, on the simplest level, in the contemporary time frame, the protagonist takes drugs, opium, I believe, and it induces past life recall. And so on this drug trip, he goes into a past life. By the way, I mean, this association between drugs and past life memory is also explored in a film by Gaspar Noé, Enter the Void, where you have a character who takes DMT, and he subsequently dies, and it's unclear in the film whether he's still on the DMT trip or he's actually died. But at any rate, he goes through the Bardo state, and this film, Enter the Void, is basically an attempt to depict the characteristics of the Bardo state, which is a parallel to the Blind Owl, because I suggest that if you put the Blind Owl next to the Tibetan Book of the Dead, you might actually reach the conclusion that the entire narrative is taking place in the Bardo state. That instead of us following the narrator as he remembers a past life from out of a contemporary time frame, both his experiences in what appear to be the contemporary epoch and his memories of a past life are subjective impressions that he's having within the transitional state between death and rebirth. And that's to account for, the psychosis of the narrator, why he seems so unhinged and disorganized in his thoughts. And it also is to account for, all of this projection, this exteriorization of one's suppressed fears and, projection onto others of dark, aspects of one's own psyche. And another parallel that you see between Enter the Void and the Blind Owl is an exploration of the ways in which taking reincarnation seriously runs up against certain taboos, like incest and the kind of relationship it's appropriate to have with one's family members versus, say, with one's lovers. In both The Blind Owl and in Enter the Void, we see how across lifetimes what are considered the customary boundaries, that distinguish types of relationships may break down. And, there's actual empirical evidence for this in the body of research that Ian Stevenson did on reincarnation, where he found a number of cases where, for example, somebody would lose their spouse. Let's say a husband would die while his wife was still alive, and then the wife would go on to remarry, and the husband would decide to come back as his former wife's child. So, the woman conceives, and the dead husband decides to come back as the child of his wife. Which brings me to another reincarnation-themed film, Birth, with Nicole Kidman as the protagonist, where Nicole Kidman's character suffers a tragic loss of her husband, and after a number of years, grudgingly remarries, and by that time, a boy's been born and raised up to 10 years of age, who winds up stalking her and ultimately claims to be a reincarnation of her dead husband. And she starts to develop this, very controversial relationship with this boy that wrecks her marriage, and that raises all kinds of questions about, social mores.
But your point is that this is not just fiction. We're talking about a database at the University of Virginia of now some 2,500 cases or more that have been investigated by researchers, largely based on young children who, as soon as they can begin to talk, start reporting memories of previous lifetimes, often with sufficient detail for researchers to actually validate them.
Yeah, some of the most disturbing cases are when a child remembers who murdered them in a previous life. And Stevenson has a number of these cases. And, it was really disturbing because Stevenson studied most of the cases from small towns where everyone knows everyone else. And you'd have a child remember who he was murdered by while that person is still out and about in society and was never charged, never even suspected of having committed that murder. And a number of films with this kind of storyline have been made. Back in the 70s, The Reincarnation of Peter Proud was one of them, where this professor starts to have flashes of a past life, and he finds the town where it transpired and ultimately has to confront the wife who murdered him and come to terms with why it is that she murdered him, because of the way he treated her and what kind of life he was living. And more recently, there's been a film, Dead Again, where the two main characters are both reincarnated, and one of them recognizes that the other was her assassin in the previous life. And in that film, the two swap sexes from one lifetime to the other. And this is relevant to the blind owl because, in the contemporary time frame, the ethereal woman that the protagonist encounters is the wife that he murdered in his past life. So there is also this issue of, a karmic connection with someone with whom one was romantically involved, but also karma involving, having murdered somebody. And so, Hedayat was way ahead of his time in looking at these questions involving reincarnation that were only explored in the West in popular films, beginning in the 1970s up to the present.
So you're proposing that an authentic Iranian revolution, and I might add parenthetically, any kind of evolution of culture anywhere else in the world to be authentic, has to confront not only the data of reincarnation, but the implications that seem to transcend all notions of conventional human social behavior and morality.
Yes, and my suggestion is that we have the resources within the Iranian heritage to do that. The pre-Islamic Iranian heritage included Buddhism and Manichaeism and Mazdakism. And these forms of spirituality survived in occulted forms in something like the Order of the Assassins, deep into the Islamic period. So to think that you could just rewind the clock 1400 years to some postulated Zoroastrian orthodoxy, which was never truly characteristic of Iranian society even before the advent of Islam, is not going to give you a genuine renaissance. A rebirth of a society requires an evolution. And so when I'm putting forth this idea of novel folklore, what I mean to suggest is that a new folklore needs to be developed in the contemporary period. I agree with Heidegger, who's adapting Nietzsche's concept of monumental history, that our approach to history and to our cultural heritage has to be one that's aimed at catalyzing future evolution and further creativity. That an antiquarian understanding of history that seeks to, in a conservative fashion, either preserve or replicate some fixed idea of the past is not going to lead to the further evolution of society. And why would you want that further evolution? Because you want it to be a dynamic, vital, creative, and ultimately for that reason, strong society, a vibrant society. I mean, a renaissance is a call for revitalization. And, a artificial recreation of some conservative ideal of what Iranian society frankly never was is not going to give you that. And what it's also going to do at this point is divide Iranians against themselves. You would see a psychotic fragmentation of Iranian society if an attempt were made to transform contemporary Iran, the contemporary society of the Islamic Republic of Iran, within the space of a few years or even a decade or two, into some kind of a neo-Zoroastrian society. You would see a catastrophic internal fragmentation and disintegration of the society. And you would also see a total isolation of Iran from its neighborhood. So instead of an Iran that's extending its influence throughout the core of the Islamic world, which is taking place today. I think we have a kind of a nascent fifth Persian Empire forming at the present time. Instead of that trajectory continuing, you would see a total isolation of Iran from the core of the Islamic world, with all surrounding countries, even Iraq and Afghanistan, that were integral parts of Iran throughout most of its history, set against this anomalous neo-Zoroastrian society, rather than being places that can benefit from and opt into an Iranian cultural renaissance that could extend throughout the entire core of the Islamic world and could help to foster a vision of world order and a better model for organizing society on a planetary scale. I think that Iran should be at that table negotiating with other great civilizations on the ideal form of our future planetary society. And Hedayat is a great resource for catalyzing that kind of Iranian Renaissance that can be globally relevant. I mean, this was a man who, spent much of his life in Europe and also sojourned in India and tried to reconnect Iran both to its Eastern Indo-European cousin in India and to its Western Indo-European cousins. And I think to portray him as an advocate of the restoration of Orthodox Zoroastrianism, or to think that that's why he was in Bombay, simply to study at the feet of the Parsis, is absurd, and it is doing a great disservice to one of the greatest geniuses in Iranian history.
Now, I know you're really aiming your discussion here towards people who are looking at what might the future of the country of Iran be, but I think it has much wider implications. And, for example, we will be releasing in a few weeks a discussion, what we've already recorded, on transhumanism and the fact that the entire human race is facing a concatenation of technologies that are all accelerating and at some point may accelerate into a spike beyond which human culture as a whole is going to be radically transformed. Probably it'll be hard for most people listening to this video today to even imagine that world.
Yes, in our discussion on transhumanism, I leveled a critique at some of the more materialist advocates of transhumanism, some of the people who conceive of the approaching technological singularity in an overly reductive, mechanistic way. However, I do agree with transhumanists on the time frame that they project for the arrival of the technological singularity. I don't think that we need to subscribe to a materialistically reductionist view of consciousness as a mere epiphenomenon of matter or anything of that kind in order to see how, within the next 30 years, genetics, robotics, information technology, nanotechnology are going to converge in a way that threatens the fundamental parameters of the human condition, that poses an existential threat to humanity on a planetary scale. And so one of the things that people who are advocating for restoration of Zoroastrianism in Iran don't understand is that if they break Iran right now with the attempt to lobotomize the country and re-engineer it from an emerging post-Islamic society into an Orthodox Neo-Zoroastrian society, if they break Iran in that process, they are not going to have the time to put the pieces back together and build up a strong Iran that can contribute to the global discussion about how we're going to navigate the challenge of the technological singularity. We only have a generation. We only have 30 years for Iran to step up to the table of major players on the planet, entering into a discussion about how best to meet the challenge of genetic engineering, or what limits to draw on artificial intelligence, or what the parameters are going to be for the use of robotics, and how to deal with, the revolutionary challenges that poses to labor and so forth. For Iranian values to play a role in that discussion, for the Iranian civilizational heritage, which I think has been more influential than the heritage of any other single civilization throughout the course of history, for that treasure trove to be relevant to the global discussion over the transition potentially beyond humanity, I think we need to keep Iran strong and to promote a social evolution in Iran and a kind of Iranian Renaissance that's evolutionary as much as it's revolutionary.
Well, Jason, Reza Jorjani, once again, a brilliant, stimulating discussion. But if I may, let me just turn to the audience and say that if you go to the comment section of this video, you will see a link to a GoFundMe page for Jason so that he can continue the important work that he is doing. Unfortunately, this brilliant intellectual has been slandered and defamed to such an extent that he's no longer employable in the academic or think tank circles where one can tell from obviously listening to him that he clearly belongs. So he's dependent right now largely on support from people in the general public who understand the crucial role that he can play in the future. So I encourage you to go to the GoFundMe page and to contribute generously to Jason Reza Jorjani. And once again, Jason, let me thank you from the bottom of my heart for coming to Albuquerque and being with me.
I'm the one who should thank you. It's been a pleasure as always, Jeffrey. Thank you for the opportunity.
And thank you for being with us.